All right, welcome to the conversation. So you probably noticed the Republicans passing bills all across the country against transgender folks. So they are the latest targets because the right wing always has to find the other, and now they, in a sense, have to expand their circle of hate. And that's what they've done. We want to bring on a reporter to talk about it. Canela Lopez is a transgender health reporter at The Insider. Canela, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me on, Cenk.
No problem. So you wrote about Pride event, and so I think most people know how it started, but just in case they don't, how did the Pride parades in America start?
Absolutely. So the Pride parades in the US kind of began as a culmination of existing organizing that was happening with queer and trans, basically activists. So this happened in 1969 in New York City. It was brought on by a lot of tension between police forces and existing queer folks who were all congregating at the Stonewall Inn, which is a historic bar that still exists in New York City today. But essentially, queer folks were sick and tired of having to exist in a situation in which police were consistently brutalizing queer folks simply for existing. At this point in New York City, there were still existing laws that banned cross-dressing and required folks to wear enough articles of clothing for the gender they were assigned at birth. So, these people were sick, they were tired. It was a lot of Black and brown trans organizers who just wanted the brutality to stop. So essentially the Stonewall Inn was raided during the month of Pride, before Pride was a thing, and people fought back. So it culminated in this big riot that ended up lasting for about 6 days. And at the end of it, we had the birth essentially of the queer liberation movement as we know it modernly. And after that point, there was a march that would happen every year to commemorate the riot and to kind of pay homage to the organizers and the work that was put in to push back against authority figures.
Is that still what's happening with Pride parades?
It's definitely shifted a bit, especially in the last, I would say, 20 years, as queer people have gotten a lot more acceptance in the US, which is fantastic. It's really important that we're seeing a lot more acceptance of queer and trans folks. However, as queer and trans folks are seen as more of a part of mainstream society, that means that our dollars really matter, particularly to corporations. So we've seen increasingly more corporations kind of sponsoring Pride events. So you'll get Bank of America, you'll get Chase, you'll get a lot of large organizations that will cater their products to Pride. Like if you look at Target's Pride collection. And this is good in some ways because there's a lot of donations that happen to queer organizations like the Human Rights Campaign, which definitely need the money to continue to do the important work that they do. However, it also means that as queerness becomes more acceptable, at least in a mainstream view, it means that the original people that it was organized for, so we're talking about sex workers, addicts, kinksters, trans folks in general, queer people of color, are really being pushed more to the margins as it becomes more acceptable and becomes more sanitized for the everyday cookie cutter American family, if that makes sense.
All right, so what's the alternative? What can we do?
I think it's really important that words are followed up with action. So representation is incredibly important. And I really don't want to undermine the importance and value of having corporations include queer people in big campaigns and make us really visible, because that means that a lot of queer and trans youth are able to see themselves growing up, which does greatly reduce suicide rates. So I don't want to undermine that, but I think it's important that words are followed up by action. So rather than corporations, asking for kink not to be at Pride or trying to push certain, forms of Pride celebrations, there just needs to be more active donation to organizations that are already driving this conversation and doing the work. So there are plenty of Black trans organizations that specifically cater to the communities that are the most marginal within the LGBTQ umbrella. So great organizations like For the Girls, the Okra Project. I think it's important for corporations to be donating to these spots and kind of letting these organizers who are local, who are already doing this work, take control of the conversation and just really redistribute resources, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and so Canela, we have Republicans, as I said in the beginning, passing laws trying to make sure that transgender athletes can't play on, I guess, girls' teams is what the laws are about. It's first of all not much of an actual problem in several states when they so-called problem when they asked, "Hey, do you know a single case of this happening?" The lawmakers who passed those laws couldn't name a single case. So that leads to the obvious conclusion that they're not trying to address any issue. But what's the issue anyway? Really, like it's just all it is hate, right? But since it doesn't even exist really as something that they could even point to, not that transgender folks don't play in high school sports, but any issue that has arisen out of that in Texas, right? As an example. By the way, their residents freeze to death, and now they have no electricity in the winter, but they're busy passing nonsense laws based on hate. But a lot of people might think, well, okay, since it's not that big of an issue, meaning like this is not a real controversy that's ripping apart different high schools, etc. It's a dumb law, it's a hateful law, but does it really, how much harm does it do? And I wanted you to address that.
The harm done by these bills, even though there's some statistics out there about the number of trans youth, it's important to understand that there are more and more trans youth coming out every day. So the idea that it doesn't affect that many people in the US, there aren't that many trans people that exist, so it isn't an issue, is really a misconception. And also, even if it's only affecting one child, it is really actively harmful to be having these bills that are targeting children for trying to exist. And advocates have said it again and again that these kinds of bills do drive up rates of suicide. They drive up rates of depression, anxiety within trans youth. And even if we allow one of these bills to pass and it only impacts like a handful of students, which that's not the case, it sets a really dangerous precedent. And it's a slippery slope, essentially. So if you pass these bills, what's to stop Republican legislators from then proposing more extreme bills that actively target trans healthcare? For example, Arkansas is the first state in the country that has passed active legislation that is going to prevent trans youth from getting life-saving medical care. It's just about the precedent that these kinds of bills set for future laws that could truly be even more harmful.
Yeah, and beyond that, I think that since they can't point to any controversies that they think they're trying to address, that the point of the bills is hate. That the idea is to propagate that hate as much as humanly possible so that they could have some others to fight back against. And so that's gonna lead to a question, because it used to be black folks in this country, and by the way, it was always everyone, right? It was black folks and gay folks and trans folks, etc., that were being discriminated against. But there were different groups that were focused on at different times politically, right? And so obviously during Jim Crow it was black folks. Then it became gay folks, and as late as 2004, for sure, Bush ran on no gay marriage, and they put that as ballot measures all across the country. But now, as more people have come out, Republicans realize, oh, I have gay folks in my family, I have LGBT people, but they don't have as many trans folks apparently that they know. So they've extended out the boundary of who it's acceptable to hate. And so what I'm curious about is, does that create any issue within the LGBTQ movement? Or no, is everybody still super united? It doesn't matter, they come for us, one of us, they come for all of us.
It's interesting being within an umbrella term, because I think that people do forget that LGBTQ stands for so many communities, right? With so many different interests. And it kind of is related to what I was speaking about earlier when we were talking about respectability and what happens when queer people become more acceptable. So even though gay marriage is legal and it's legally recognized now, there are plenty of, queer folks who are able to get married. That doesn't necessarily mean there's the same kind of respectability for trans people. So what's interesting is you do see a lot of cisgender gay folks who will actively be standing against trans people and say that, you're setting back the movement by advocating for your views. You're setting back the movement because you're not a part of, what is respectable currently. So, I mean, we even see that when within the trans community, right? So you'll get people who are able to access hormones, who, are wealthier or white and are able to look a certain way and be acceptable trans people. Whereas, you get non-binary folks who may not want to start hormones in the first place. So there's definitely a lot of fractioning within the community and so many different interests that need to be represented within 1 month, which makes it even more frustrating when corporations are getting involved with their own interest.
And we should not allow Republicans to pass these hateful laws anywhere without clearly explaining and pointing out, no, that is specifically for hatred. And if you're with that, you're on that side, and there should be no equivocation about it. So I hope whether it's Pride events or anything else, that message gets out clearer. But Canela Lopez writes about this for Insider. So Canela, thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate it.
Thanks again for having me.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.